Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. Well, Tim, you were at the Heritage Resource Bank Conference in Nashville last week and was able to pick up a couple of great interviews. So tell us about the Heritage Resource Bank. I'm sure that many of our listeners are also supporters of the great work of the Heritage Foundation. And also, how did you like Nashville?
Well, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Resource Bank, it's an annual conference where really the leading conservative and free market leaders and thinkers gather together to talk about policy ideas, to network, to kind of strategize, form new alliances and bonds over, policy ideas and policy reforms that really, would lead to more freedom in people's lives, more prosperity for all, get rid of some of these, government mandates and shackles that are hindering our prosperity and hindering, our ability to live our lives as we wish and become entrepreneurs. So it really is quite the thing to see, really kind of all in one place. So you hear, we got to hear from some great national conservative leaders, obviously with a Tennessee flair, but we heard speeches from the governor of Tennessee. We got to hear the great national star, Jason Miyares, who's the new Attorney General of Virginia. And there were even some celebrities. We saw Kirk Cameron, the star of TV's Growing Pains, who was promoting his new movie on homeschooling. And we also saw the Hasselbeck brothers, Matt and Tim, who are, both former NFL quarterbacks, and they're both TV football commentators now. So it was really an interesting week in Nashville, and you get to learn about all sorts of issues and issues that PRI is working on, like ESG investing and school choice and parental, increasing the role of parents in their children's education, and how nonprofits and the private sector can more effectively lift people out of poverty. Now, I will say, while I was there, and many Californians will sympathize with this, so I'm sure everybody has a friend or a neighbor who has had enough and relocated from California to Tennessee. And I certainly did. And I met with my friend who I worked with in the legislature and now is chief of staff to one of the legislative leaders in Tennessee. So we met for lunch and I asked him, what is it like? Because California, we have the liberal supermajority in the legislature. It is a mirror opposite in Tennessee. And I asked him, well, what's it like to actually have power? What can you do? And he told me, well, this year alone, we cut taxes by $300 million. We reformed education funding, so funding follows the child. And we basically enacted criminal justice reform, so dangerous criminals are locked up behind bars and aren't given early release. And I thought, well, I need to find a good realtor, because I was ready to put the house up for sale and move. And I think the more people, fed up Californians, learn about what's going on in Tennessee, I think many more people may be enticed to move as well. Although my friends who I saw who lived there, their friends and neighbors, well, they might like it if we went, but in general, they do not want Californians to come. So while I was there, and it's a great city, there's great fun in downtown Nashville. There's just life and color and great food and great music. And, you really get to see, of course, the history of country music. And got to go to the Country Music Hall of Fame and the Ryman Auditorium, which was the original home of the Grand Ole Opry. And I interviewed some very interesting people that will present this week and next. So this week we interview Robert Alt, who's the president of the Buckeye Institute, which is PRI's sister think tank in Ohio. And Robert is a former Californian, and we talk about his story of working in the California legislature during the infamous days of Doris Allen. And my friends from that era will say, well, you didn't really earn your stripes unless Doris Allen fired you. So you'll hear his story. And we talk about their work, and they do policy work in addition to legal work. and they have been doing a lot of work fighting this government overreach during the COVID-19 pandemic. And he talks about a case where they're fighting over, a bartender or a bar owner who was really unfairly targeted by a Washington, D.C.'s municipal government, really for the crime of standing up and saying, all people are welcome during the COVID pandemic. And that one, brave individual who said something that really we all should be able to rally around, earn the scorn of the municipal government, and a fight that still is not 100% settled today, 2 years after the start of the pandemic. So it's an interesting case that you'll hear about. And I think it provides a big lesson about a government overreach during times of emergency.
Yeah, the Buckeye Institute has done tremendous work for their state. They also took the lead on court cases in the big Supreme Court Janus decision. They're an awesome think tank. Robert Alt has been a terrific leader, and we're proud to be in the trenches fighting the good fight with them. So here's President Robert Alt.
Well, Robert Alt, thank you so much for joining us for Next Round Podcast. We're here in Nashville at the Resource Bank Conference, and we're happy you could make time today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
We're excited to have the opportunity to chat with you today about the work of the Buckeye Institute. But before we dive into the policy discussions, our listeners may not know that you're a one-time Californian and you had a successful career, an interesting career in politics and policy in California. So tell us about your time in California and what took you from our once golden state to working on public policy issues in Ohio. And for our listeners who may not know about the Buckeye Institute, tell us about your work.
Well, you've definitely done your homework. Yes, I in fact am a native Californian, something of a unicorn there, I suppose. And back in the mid-'90s, in another era, in another time, you will recall that at one point the House was evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, and there was a power-sharing agreement under which Jim Brulte, who was the Republican leader at the time, had a budget to start a Republican Office of Assembly Research. And so I was one of the first hires for that office. I worked on a number of legal policies, including looking at affirmative action policy in the state. Essentially, my first day on the job, this was a quite tumultuous time. There'd been a recall. There was going to be a new individual seated that was going to give the Republicans a majority in the state house, something which I think is almost inconceivable at this point. And the day before that individual was to be seated, then Speaker Willie Brown was able to work with Doris Allen, who was a Republican, to get her to run for Speaker, and she was elected with all the Democrat votes, and Willie Brown became Speaker Emeritus, following which all the Republican employees in the Assembly were forced to go through employment reviews, sort of quasi-firing. So it was a very interesting time to be in Sacramento, and it was an interesting introduction into bare-knuckle politics. Willie Brown had a remarkable ability to run the Assembly with an iron fist, and it was interesting to witness it firsthand. So, but yes, I ended up after California, I went off to D.C., where I worked for the Heritage Foundation for a number of years, including for former Attorney General Ed Meese. And then I ended up getting a job, my current job, running the Buckeye Institute. And so you'd asked what work it is that Buckeye does. So you have a very learned listenership, I'm sure. PRA is a wonderful organization. So your listeners probably know what a think tank is, but being in Ohio, not everyone does. And so when I frequently, when I'm hopping in an Uber, I'll get asked, what is it you do? And so I'll explain to your listeners the way I explained it to one Uber driver. Oftentimes, if you try and explain sort of broad themes or theories, it's a little too abstract. So I decided I would tell the driver what it is that I'd been working on. And so I explained that Ohio was the only state in the country that had a salon manager license requirement. If you owned a salon, you had to have a licensed manager on premises during all the hours you were open. And just to sort of put this into context in terms of the level of requirement here, to become an emergency medical technician, an EMT, in the state of Ohio, people are literally putting their lives in your hands. You needed to go through about 2 months of training. To become a cosmetologist in the state of Ohio, people are literally putting their nails in your hands. You had to go through about 7 months of training. And to become a cosmetology manager, you had to tack on an additional approximately 2.5 months of training. Would cost you an additional $5,000. This is full-time training, so you couldn't necessarily be working during this time. And we looked into it, and there was just no good justification for this. And so we set about to eliminate this requirement. It ended up being a huge impediment to hardworking individuals who were seeking to advance in their career, who weren't able to dedicate the $5,000 and the time off work in order to do this. It was a huge problem for salon owners who were looking to promote individuals and couldn't do so because of this requirement, which really didn't do anything to advance the business. And so, of course, like most common sense reforms, this is something that took far more to get done than should have. But eventually, Buckeye was successful. We got the reform passed, and we got it signed into law. And so I explained, this is fundamentally what I do. I help to remove barriers to prosperity, to help individuals flourish, to help them to be able to make a living and to fulfill, live a more fulfilling life. At this point, the driver literally slams on the brakes. I thought he was going to hit something. He turns around and shakes my hand, and he explains to me that he is driving Uber as a second job. He drives it as a second job to make money to pay for his daughter's beauty school. And when he went to sign the documents to sign her, which was just a few weeks before, and to pay the tuition, he looked down and saw that it was $20,000 for the tuition. And he said to them, "Now, I don't mean to complain, but I thought you had quoted me $25,000 for the tuition." And they said, "Yes, but that was before there'd been a change. There's no longer a cosmetology manager's license, so she no longer has to spend that extra time and the extra $5,000 to get that license." So this was an example of a change that we were able to make that had an impact to his daily life, to his second job and to the amount of hours that he was going to have to put into driving Uber to support his daughter in her beauty school education. So Buckeye does broadly economic and legal policy work, and we also have a legal center where we provide pro bono representation to our clients.
So we're so happy to have you on today to talk about your efforts to rein in out of control government power, which we're familiar with that a little bit in California, certainly the front row seat we had during the COVID-19 pandemic with Governor Newsom's emergency orders that have long outlasted the height of the pandemic. And, it's great to see the Buckeye Institute has taken on some of these abuses of government power directly. So you're involved with an interesting case where Washington, D.C. bar owners were fighting COVID mandates they're imposed in the name of emergency powers. Tell us about their case and what happened to them.
Sure. So we represent Eric Flannery, who is a Navy veteran, and he's the owner of The Big Board, which is a restaurant and bar on Capitol Hill. It's really a neighborhood bar. And Eric had the audacity to send out a tweet after the Washington, D.C., after having, at this point, I think the emergency orders had been dragging on for just shy of 2 years. The mayor issued a new emergency order requiring restaurant and bar owners to check the vaccination status, to verify the vaccination status of anyone who was entering their establishment, and requiring the employees and the patrons of establishments to wear masks when they were not actively consuming food or beverage. And essentially, this would require them as well to reject service to anyone who did not have proof of vaccination. And so Eric sent out a tweet the day before this rule was to take effect, stating that in his bar, everyone is welcome yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That was the extent of it. And the D.C. government came down on him like a ton of bricks. The very next day, he was visited by the first of many D.C. agents who came in to verify whether, in fact, he was violating the rule. Ultimately, 3 separate agencies ended up pulling his licenses and or citing him for violations of the rule. He was closed down for over 6 weeks. In fact, D.C. ended up retracting their vaccination requirement and their masking requirement, but nonetheless, the agencies still refused to permit him to reopen. So the Buckeye Institute represented Eric, still does. We were able to actually negotiate with the 3 agencies to get his licenses reinstated. However, the battle continues. DC Health is continuing to seek additional fines and penalties against Eric and against the big board for those previous violations, and so we're continuing to represent him in that matter, arguing fundamentally that the mayor, in fact, lacked the legal authority to promulgate the emergency orders to begin with, and that the DC Health was relying upon unlawful orders in citing him for those violations.
So what's going on in Washington is by no means an isolated example. And we had the chance on Next Round podcast about 18 months ago or so. We interviewed a pair of bar and restaurant owners in Napa Valley who, during the pandemic, they were challenging Governor Newsom's executive orders. They felt left them really shut down or unable to run their business, and they believed and argued, we know how to do it. We can do it safely. So given your experience with the Washington, D.C. bar owners, do you think what happened to them could also happen to other bar restaurant owners or other small business owners, in a future emergency, especially those who speak out against what we all see as government overreach?
Unfortunately, I think it's a genuine threat, and so you have seen some states have responded to this by passing legislation to curtail the use of executive power. There have been some successful lawsuits that have also challenged the duration of these emergency orders, the scope of the powers that are utilized. But we saw a number of very nonsensical rules that were applied in states across the country, as well as the District of Columbia. And we also saw, quite frankly, the hypocrisy and the hubris of some of the executives for whom the rules apply to everyone else, but the French Laundry must continue to serve them. So regrettably, I do fear this, and it's one of the reasons, despite the fact that I think many of us feel that the pandemic, certainly at least the emergency stage of the pandemic, is in the rearview mirror. It's worthwhile, if you live in a state that continues to have the broad emergency powers that had been utilized during the pandemic, to do a critical reevaluation. And I think you're seeing that, whether there have been a number of pieces of model legislation that are either being worked on presently through things like the Uniform Law Commission, or ALEC, I think, has taken up potential model legislation. In addition, a number of states have begun to enact legislation to address these issues. So I think it's definitely something that needs to be taken very seriously, because the threat is real. And my general fear, or I should say concern associated with this issue, is law tends to oftentimes create one-way ratchets. And so once you have actually established that there is a broad emergency power, that ends up being a precedent for a future emergency. It doesn't have to be identical in nature, but the precedent justifying that potential use of power is there, and that becomes a very real potential threat to liberties in the future as well. So I think we need to be vigilant about whether or not the past pandemic becomes prologue to a future emergency order.
So we here at PRI could give you dozens of examples of government overreach by elected officials in California during the pandemic, and citing their executive powers, of course. But cases like this one, and really could argue years of overreach by Governor Newsom, naturally begs the question, what does constitute reasonable emergency powers being exercised by a governor or government? And what is an overreach? What is the proper role of government during an emergency? We know about the pandemic, obviously, is the closest case, but, our Dan Kolke has written about how the governors actually could use their emergency powers for good on things like relaxing regulations for wildfire prevention, or, even getting rid of some of the regulations so you could streamline the home building process in California to alleviate the housing crisis. So what are your thoughts on this big question?
Well, I think streamlining regulations actually is key, and in fact, when done properly, it was key during the pandemic. So the Buckeye Institute, we actually have, I would say, we're sympathetic to some of the expertise of PRI in terms of we have genuine healthcare experts on staff, and so because of this, we worked with the administration in Ohio and in states across the country to have a critical evaluation of regulations that were on the books that served as impediments to actually dealing with the pandemic. So, for instance, Ohio had cumbersome regulations with regard to delivery of telehealth services. Essentially, pre-pandemic, you were in many cases required to actually have an in-person visit with your doctor before you could get a referral for a telehealth visit. We went ahead and worked with the governor to streamline these regulations on an emergency basis, and then ultimately to make those changes permanent, because quite frankly, these were regulations that didn't make sense whether there was a pandemic or not. But in addition, we went ahead and worked to streamline scope of practice requirements, which permitted nurses to be able to deliver more services. We also worked with the administration to permit medical students to be able to provide certain medical services in emergencies. Again, common sense, deregulatory emergency changes that sought to actually streamline the delivery of healthcare services during the pandemic. And another one that I'm quite proud of was we also made it possible for pharmacists to administer COVID tests, which particularly in a state like Ohio that has large rural areas, this prevented individuals who were potentially infected from having to travel longer distances and to go into hospitals. They could actually go ahead and get the testing done locally. In addition, we also worked on removing regulatory barriers during the shutdown. So the restaurants that weren't permitted to be open for sit-down business, but were permitted to do takeout business, we worked and promoted policy that allowed them to do takeout alcohol sales, so that they could, in fact, make a sufficient profit to stay in business. So these are the sorts of things where you take a look, just given the peculiar necessities on the ground created by the pandemic, where where a governor could use his or her emergency powers to eliminate, streamline, or put a pause on regulations that were counterproductive.
One of the things that we've done at PRI, the LA Times did us a favor a few months back when they termed California as the de facto think tank of the Biden administration. And so we decided in response, having had a front row seat to decades of bad policy ideas, to launch what we call the Been There, Done That campaign, to warn the rest of the country about the bad ideas from California that would be infiltrating not only Washington, but also other state capitals. So the Buckeye Institute, obviously you have a front row seat working on policy and legislation in Ohio. What are some of the kind of bad ideas from California that you're seeing infiltrate your state, and hopefully you're having luck and saying, stop, don't do that?
So, unfortunately, an example comes to mind in particular. California has one of the most aggressive tax departments in the country. The franchise tax board, for people for tax practitioners is notorious, and they're notorious because they tend to have a very expansive interpretation of their taxing authority, and the board and the state itself, through the legislature, has sought to expand its authority to tax as much as possible, and are seeking new and unique ways to apply state taxation extraterritorially. One example, which has not yet come to fruition, but I know has been proposed, is the exit tax. The idea that an individual who previously resided in California, that they would be able to go ahead and tax them for a period of years after they no longer were residing or earning money within the state of California, which is a pretty drastic idea. But the idea of taxing funds when you no longer are a resident, you're no longer domiciled in California, you're no longer in fact physically working or earning money in California. And so unfortunately, some species of this actually was enacted into law in Ohio during the pandemic as one of the emergency laws that was passed. So Ohio, actually, I will say we have a bad idea that I think even California has not adopted yet, which is we have one of the most complex systems of local income taxation in the country. So we not only have a state income tax, we also have local income tax, and in fact, we can have overlapping local income taxes. So if you live in one municipality that has a local income tax and you work in a second municipality that has a local income tax, they are not required to offset each other. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, sometimes they'll do a partial offset, but it's not unusual for individuals to have to pay to one or two different municipalities, and they have to pay wherever it is that they perform work. So if they end up working in multiple different municipalities, they may end up owing taxes to multiple different cities over the course of a year. Enter the pandemic. So you have a large number of individuals who commute into major cities. And so the General Assembly went ahead, and the rule in Ohio with regard to local income taxes is a municipality can tax an individual if they're a resident in that city, and on that they can tax monies that they earn any place in the world. So if in fact I live in a city and I go out of state and get paid for work there, that the city where I live, they have the right to tax those earnings. And a city can tax a non-resident who performs work in that city. But the rule has always been only for the work actually performed on those particular days in that city. Enter the pandemic. Now all of a sudden you have a ton of commuters who are no longer commuting. In fact, they are legally required not to commute. It's a misdemeanor offense if in fact you are a non-essential worker and you show up at your place of business. And so the state legislature, the General Assembly, passes a law that says during the period of the state of emergency, and for 30 days thereafter, anyone who previously had been working at a principal place of business will be deemed to have performed their work there for the purposes of calculating their income tax. Now, I don't know about you. I grew up watching Mr. Rogers, and I'm as much of a fan of Mr. Rogers as the next guy, but let's pretend, and the land of make-believe is not how we generally calculate income tax. And that's exactly how they were doing it. So the Buckeye Institute has sued just about every major city in Ohio, arguing that this violates about 70 years of unbroken precedent before the Ohio Supreme Court. So we have cases at various stages. We have a petition pending before the Ohio Supreme Court asking them to take one of the cases. We've got another that's in the Court of Appeals and another that is still in district court. So fingers crossed on that. But this is one of those ones where I think the potential implications of this case could extend far beyond Ohio. I'd hate to actually see Ohio have this bad idea and perhaps export it to California to have you all pick up on this bad idea, which it seems like there's already this impetus in California to try and run with something like this. So,
as someone looking to retire outside California, I hope you are successful in your efforts to fight this sliding scale when you leave the state issue, because the punishment of paying taxes there over the years was not enough. Now we have to pay for the privilege of escaping. But so on that note, and thinking of those, I have our last question, which is always my favorite question. We call our podcast Next Round because of our proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy over a great glass of wine. So either to drink away our troubles with these bad issues we're talking about or celebrate the great success of your work, what beer or wine or cocktail or other beverage do you recommend our listeners try when we come visit you in Ohio?
Well, I'm going to get in trouble here, but let me begin by saying I do not recommend the wine. It's among my personal pet peeves that Ohio, in terms of handing out subsidies, at times has given subsidies to wine growers in Ohio, which I'm just not going to offer any comment on that. It's bad policy in support of, other than it's bad policy in support of bad wine. But in Ohio, I think the beverage, we have a very strong craft brewing industry there. So it depends what part of the state you're going to. If you're going up to the Cleveland area, Great Lakes Brewery is a long-standing brewery, and they've got a pretty good distribution. So some of your listeners may have been able to actually even get their beer in California, but there's they have a great location there just outside of Cleveland. If you're coming to Columbus, Seventh Son Brewery is a great brewery and one you should try. There's several good breweries there. Elevator Brewing Company is another one. Both of those have great craft beers. And then if you are going to Cincinnati, Rheingeist is a very good craft brewer. So that would be my recommendation. And then, but if you're in Cincinnati, then not to give homage to another state, but then you just cross the river and you're in bourbon country. So and the Bourbon Trail is right there at our doorstep. So good beverages to be had, but as for wine, I would say I'll join you in Napa for a glass of cab.
Well, on that note, Robert, I vote let's adjourn and go have a virtual glass of wine with our listeners here. And thank you so much for taking the time out to join us for Next Round today.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.